Next, we turn to a charming and inspirational story of a couple who settled in Niagara Falls after both serving for Britain in World War II. Christopher Graham joins us from his home in Mississauga. Christopher, John and Jean Marshall, they were your maternal grandparents?
Yes, and they lived down in the Falls.
Now, they were living in Belfast. They were inspired to basically enlist. And were they married at the time?
Yeah, they were fairly newly married. They were married 2.5 years at that point. And the sense of duty for king and country was really strong with them and within their community. And once war was declared, they headed down to the beautiful Belfast City Hall and enlisted in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force.
They both set out to enlist in the Air Force, but your grandfather ended up in the Royal Navy. How did that happen?
They had a plan that they were going to go and join the Air Force together, so that they could stay at home. They loved Belfast more than anything, and there were airfields being built across the island of Ireland, and that was their goal. But my grandfather was a steam fitter, and he worked at Harlan Wolff. And as soon as they saw his application resume, they said, "No, son, you are joining the Navy." So he came out, and he had to explain to his wife that he was going to sea. And I think that was a fairly awkward conversation. I don't think she took that news very well. And they wouldn't let him change his mind at that point.
They wouldn't have seen each other then really until the end of the war in those two different arms of the armed forces.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That was one of the last times they saw each other because he shipped out to training fairly soon after that point, and he was at sea basically from then till the end of the war. He came home to convalesce a couple of times. I think they met up in Liverpool a couple of times, but that was about it. And for newlyweds to then not see each other for that whole time and just get telegraphs and letters back and forth was difficult. Was difficult, especially Belfast was blitzed. My grandmother was still there. He would have known. Telecommunication lines were down, so no one knew who survived for quite a while. It was quite a scary time.
What was Jean's responsibility? What did she do during the war?
This took me a long time to kind of figure out. She was running orders back and forth from the command hut to the pilots as they would be heading out for the Battle of Britain. And sometimes when I think about that, she would have been the last person that some of these pilots saw. And she's running out to give these guys their orders, knowing that she was probably going to be the last person that they saw. It's quite a powerful thing when you think about it, that they were all just so focused on protecting and saving their group of islands.
Did they talk much about their reunion when the war ended? Did they reunite back in Belfast before they came to Niagara Falls?
They lived in Belfast for another probably about 10, 15 years, and then they came with their children to Ontario, and the family sort of settled in the Niagara region in sometime in the late 70s, and they just fell in love with Niagara.
Belfast, like London, was shelled during the war. What was life like them for those 10 or 15 years that they stayed in Belfast before coming here?
Both a time of rebuilding, because there's parts of the city center that were decimated, housing estates that were just taken right out, and then things moved rather quickly again to another war zone of people's own making. So in some ways, parts of the city of Belfast didn't really start to recover until the late 90s, early 2000s. But it was a very different time. And after having lived through the war and after having lived through the Blitz and the subsequent PTSD, everyone just referred to it as shell shock. My grandparents didn't want to live through a conflict in their own streets, and so they made their way to Canada.
Now, your grandfather was on a ship during the war, and I understand that ship itself was shelled as well, and he survived that.
Yeah, he was on the HMS Spartan, which was a Dido-class cruiser, and in the Battle of Anzio in Italy, they were a German torpedo missile dropped from one of the planes, and fluke shot right down the steam pipe and into the boiler room where he was, and miraculously he survived. He remembered just as the explosion hit. He remembered waking up in the water, and then he remembered waking up in a hospital. And it's crazy because there's footage. There's footage from another ship of the survivors being pulled out of the water and all of that. And, that's one of the craziest things you'll ever watch, is just trying to seeing these men floating and thinking, well, there's my granddad.
You talked about shell shock, PTSD as we call it now. They didn't like to talk a lot about their experience during the war when you knew them, correct?
It's horrific. And my grandfather at the end of the war didn't really take it so well as one could probably imagine, and it was just something that was best not to talk about. And it wasn't until he was in his early 70s that he began to talk about it a little bit and kind of share that story. But even still, it was pretty guarded. It was pretty light, and it's just been through some of my own readings that I put together other things.
Christopher, can I ask, when did John and Jean pass away?
He passed in 1997, and she passed in 2003.
Christopher, what an inspirational story. What a couple. Thank you so much for sharing this for our Remembrance Day special.